Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Derek Cohen. He is our Chief Research Officer. All right, Derek, we are through session. We are past the session examinations and evaluations. And everybody thought that we were going to have a clean sailing, smooth summer. You get your vacation, head to the beach. Everybody get ready for the 90th. But
they thought that back around the 2nd of June. We were so young and innocent back then.
Yeah, back then. But that's not the case.
No.
We are going to have a special session. And is it our fault? Because we used to throw we tried not to throw the S word out there, but maybe putting it out there into the world means
spoken into existence.
Yeah. Does it surprise you at all that we're having a special session?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at just what was being said, even towards the end of the regular session, there were still lingering issues. We talked obviously with Brad about judicial pay and things like that had a potential to cause that, but we only had if you look at the proximate cause, I don't think this is the cause, but I think it's one of the contributing causes. Obviously boils down to the veto on SB3, and so I think that was something that the governor addressed, but in doing so kind of created an even greater clarion call for that special session, which we had heard rumors about previously.
Now, Democrats are already vowing not to come back for the special session, saying that there's nothing on the call that would encourage them or that they feel is necessary for them to come back. Are there any repercussions or consequences for skipping out on the job that they were elected to do?
Oh, yeah. There must be citing. I think they're citing that constitutional provision saying the vibes are off. You don't have to come to work.
Yeah, it must be it.
Yeah, I tried using that when I worked for Chuck, and yeah, he's not receptive to that at all. But no, I think that if you remember back into 2021, we had the quorum break that happened once during regular session and then once and perpetually during the specials that happened. And coming back in 23, they actually passed a fairly robust, I wouldn't say it was 100%, but they did put a little bit more a punishment, more stick in that, including being able to target for the unexcused people their actual campaign accounts. Now, here's the thing. Here's the question. One of the things that have been discussed about putting on the call is congressional redistricting, right? Now, here's the quandary. Would you take that $500 a day hit or whatever it is, knowing full well that you're going to be topped back up if you deny the Republicans a congressional majority come next year? I think that's
by outside donors or
exactly. That's the calculus I think that's going on
right.
in the heads of certain folks.
Well,
right
we
now.
will leave that to what to watch for. The final segment.
I'm watching
on our
for
show. But as you mentioned Chuck DeVore, of course, the CPPF's Chief National Initiatives Officer. I wanted to bring you in on this, Chuck. We asked Chuck because obviously the number one issue right now is Iran and Israel, and Chuck has written about that and has done a bunch of media interviews. So we want to have him here on our podcast. So number one, this is the first appearance of Chuck DeVore on our podcast, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
so,
you finally got through to my agent.
Yeah, well, we finally figured out an issue, where you could come down and wax eloquent, although you can do that on a lot of different issues. But thank you for finally accepting our, begging invitation over the years.
Your terms were acceptable.
Excellent. All right. Well, so I want to bring you in on this. At the beginning of the show, we always like to do kind of a hot take, kind of what's going on in the world. And we will just call this Trump's F-bomb heard around the world. Speaking of bombs, Trump's F-bomb heard around the world. And we don't need to show it because I'm sure everybody's seen it 1,000 times. But it got me thinking about, this is, not to use recency bias, but that's a pretty good hot, military or quote from a president during a time of our military conflict. So I started thinking, what was your favorite quote? Like, there are a lot of famous quotes from presidents, during war, after war, talking about war. And Chuck, you of course have a military background, so I was curious to know if you had a favorite quote.
Well, I mean, first of all, just to put the Trump quote in context, and it was a pretty cool quote, right? They did a survey a few years ago about the classes of Americans or types of Americans who use the most profane language. And that would be people from New York, military or military veterans, and people who've been in prison. And in my family, we have 2 of the 3, and none of us has been to prison. So neither my wife or I were that shocked by the president's comments.
Well,
he sounded like a son of Queens, actually.
Even though, yeah, right. Even though, this is a family show, I was going to ask, do we have a favorite, like, saucy political quote, like something that was a little bit edgy, but I thought we might, get banned or fired or something.
So to your question, my favorite, I worked for Reagan back when I was a kid. I was, for a time, the youngest Reagan appointee in the Pentagon. Someone had to be. And I was actually at the Berlin Wall just a couple of weeks after Reagan's famous Berlin Wall speech. So, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That would be my favorite kind of military or foreign policy related presidential comment.
Very famous and very, very good quote. Derek, do you have a famous military quote?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with Winston Churchill, actually. And so this was shortly after the U.S. had entered World War II, and obviously Churchill spent a lot of time at the White House coordinating with President Roosevelt. And obviously President Roosevelt, who, lives in the White House, kind of felt he had the, leave to go whatever, and barges into Churchill's stateroom right after he was getting out of the shower, getting out of the bath, I can't remember what it was. And Churchill, taken by surprise, just goes, "Well, Mr. President, let no one say that there's anything between America and the British people." or something to that effect. And I was just like, being able to think on your feet like that, that kind of a moment was pretty...
Churchill, definitely known for that. Famous ones, of course, Abraham Lincoln's "A house divided against itself cannot stand." That's a good one. We have John F. Kennedy's "Mankind must put an end to war. A war will put an end to mankind." And then, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower's warning against the military-industrial complex. But I kind of went with the more humorous ones. George W. Bush gave us a bunch of really funny ones. The most famous, I think, is probably when he got tripped up trying to think of the old quote, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." His initial quote was, "We must stop the terror." Let's see. There's an old saying in Tennessee. I know it's in Texas, probably Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again." Yeah. To which everybody
I believe The Who said that.
Yeah, The Who said that. And then just maybe one of my personal favorites was when he was giving a press conference on a tee box one time during the invasion of Afghanistan. And he said, "We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you." And then he looks into the camera and he says, "Now watch this drive." And of course, he walks over to the tee box and just smokes one down the fairway. So, good stuff there.
Look, if the clubs are hot that day and you want to call attention to it, it's a high risk, high reward kind of
yeah, that's
move.
true. If he had pulled one into the bushes, probably wouldn't have been as good of a moment. All right, shameless plug. I always plug the newsletter. If you're not signed up for that, please do that. TexasPolicy.com/thepost. But I also want to shamelessly plug our YouTube page. We now have over 100,000 subscribers. For this year, we've gotten over 40 million views on all of our videos. We get average about 6 million views a month on that. Our video team's doing a great job of putting out really, really good content on Instagram and YouTube. So go to our YouTube page, TPPF's YouTube page. Just Google it. Got a lot of cool stuff, including this show, which if you're watching it, you're probably on our YouTube page. Anyway, a lot of good podcasts and other kind of clips.
Brian, you should have told me earlier that you get 6 million views a month. I would have come on sooner.
See? Yeah. See, we got to get the stats out there, and then now it's worth your time.
Now you're talking. You can't get rid of me now.
You're more a tie, yeah. You're gonna be barging in and breaking.
Wait a minute. I have something to say.
This is the right idea with Chuck DeVore. All right, well, let's get into the interview because we don't really do. We did the show every week during the session, and obviously we're talking about domestic policy and everything Texas related, some national stuff, but really haven't ever gotten into foreign policy or national security, which is probably one of the reasons why we haven't had you on. But I mean, this is the week for it. I mean, this is absolutely the week for it. And so why don't you just give us a lay of the land? I mean, this issue, these events are rapidly changing. I mean, every minute we're in a peace deal and in a ceasefire, and then all of a sudden they drop a bunch of bombs, and Trump's dropping F-bombs and getting mad at our allies. So where are we as of right now, Wednesday afternoon? Where are we on this? What's your current assessment? Who's winning? Yeah. What's next? That kind of thing.
Well, I think the important thing to understand about what's been happening in the Middle East between Israel and Iran is that some 2 weeks ago, as the result of Israeli intelligence that suggested that the Iranians were getting very, very close to having enough refined U-235 to be able to make potentially up to 11, maybe even up to 22 nuclear bombs. And so based on their understanding of the situation, they decided that they needed to go and try to eliminate or certainly push back the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. And it's important to understand that for most traditional nations, you look at like the old Soviet Union or today's Russia, which has the largest number of nuclear warheads, China, which is rapidly building up its nuclear arsenal, America, Britain, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and even Israel. With those nations, it's commonly assumed that mutual assured destruction or deterrence is why they want those weapons. In other words, we have them, don't mess with us, right? We can attack you back. But with the Iranians, they are a theocracy. They're a corrupt theocratic state. And they have claimed constantly that we will use any means possible to destroy the great Satan, which is America, and the little Satan, which is Israel. They also believe their brand of Islam believes in kind of creating apocalyptic conditions to bring about the 13th Imam, which is kind of like their Messiah-like figure. So they actually think in their ideology that by potentially triggering a nuclear holocaust, that maybe they would bring on the end of days. Mm-hmm. So these aren't exactly people that we're used to dealing with. So that just to set the stage, right? Mm-hmm. And so then Israel gets this information that says they're getting really close. Now, what's happening is you have to enrich uranium to be able to use it in a bomb. So what happens is you take uranium, which is normally a whole bunch of U-238 with a little bit of U-235, you turn it into a gas called uranium hexafluoride, and then you run it through a whole cascade of centrifuges over time until you keep refining and refining and refining and get the heavier uranium that you can use in a bomb. Well, the Iranians had managed to push, we think, the enriched uranium to about 60%. Now, you need 90% for a bomb. People are like, well, that's still far away. Well, no, it's not. It's actually harder in the beginning when you first start to enrich uranium, when it's at like 3 or 5%. 235. When you're at 60, you're actually just like one turn of the centrifuges away from getting to 90, right? And then you're in business for bomb making. And so Israel was like, oh my gosh, we have to act now. So when they started to attack Iran, what did? They attacked the leadership of the Iranian Air Force. They attacked various anti-missile sites, which they had done in a previous action several months ago. That allowed their Air Force to have complete free range over Iran. They also killed and targeted nuclear engineers and scientists. This would have been like in 1944 if the Germans or the Japanese found out what we were doing and they targeted Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, who was like the supervisor of the Manhattan Project. And so I think something on the order of a dozen of those scientists and engineers were killed in these targeted assassinations. And still, at that point, Israel wasn't quite done because the one facility that had the largest amount of centrifuges was buried deep underground. And the only way the Israel could get at it was with a high-risk commando raid. And that was the the Fordow facility. Fordow was buried deep underground. Now, of course, America had the capacity to get at Fordow. You could argue that so did the Israelis, but it would have been a high-risk operation. Mm-hmm. And so that's the call that President Trump made. I think a very courageous call. He sent, I think it was 7 B-2 bombers over Iran with a strike package that included F-22s and F-35s to kind of escort those bombers, as well as electronic warfare aircraft that launched off of aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea or nearby the Arabian Sea.
I want to ask about that because that's one of the things that has fascinated me about this as we've learned the details. I mean, these bombers, these planes took off from Missouri and flew 8,000 miles across the Atlantic, across Europe, across Iraq, and into Iranian airspace, strapped with the largest non-nuclear bombs known to man, creeped up on, these sites, obliterated them, turned right back around and went home without so much as like a single, warning a sound or a single shot really fired from Iran. How does that happen? How does Iran not have not know that
Right.
these things are coming into their airspace?
So there's several things going on at once. I mean, first of all, we can thank Israel for their preparation of the battle space. So Israel, over a period of time, beginning several months ago, when you had that one exchange where they destroyed several Iranian air defense sites, and then ongoing in that 11-day war that they had with Iran, where they destroyed basically the remainder of the Iranian anti-aircraft missile defense. Now, there could have been some missile platforms that would have been operational, but without the radar and the networking, you're kind of shooting in the dark. So that's number one. Number two, when those B-2s aren't operating alone. They're not just 7 bombers, albeit stealth bombers, but older stealth bombers, right? They were actually reaching production when I was in the Pentagon as a kid, almost 40 years ago, right? So these things have been around, not as long as the B-52s, but they've been around for a while. So they're going in then escorted with these F-35s and F-22s, air superiority aircraft in the case of the 22s, and just all-around stealth fighters in the case of the F-35s. But in addition to that, you saw the electronic warfare aircraft called Growlers launching from, I think, a couple of aircraft carriers in the, just off the coast, right? They end up basically scrambling and suppressing the radar signals. So if there was an operational Iranian radar, or like a radar on an individual anti-aircraft platform, then that radar would be severely degraded. And so, and they went in on a moonless night, right? So there was not a lot of natural illumination to be able to see anything.
I mean, if your country of 100 million people or whatever it was, is relying on the light of the moon in order to protect your...
Well, that was one of the few technologies Israel left them with.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually a big...
it's
interesting because moon phases still are a big deal in military planning, right? Because the different types of night vision equipment or the Mark I eyeball obviously work different in different conditions at night or day. So that's how the effort went in. And to me, the most amazing thing was, if you look at Fordow, which was deeply buried, I think 12 of the 14 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators were dedicated to that site. Mm-hmm. And what's important about centrifuges is they're very delicate. They need to be perfectly balanced. And so as you're collapsing the tunnels and the cavern in which these things are operating, even if it isn't a total cataclysmic collapse, there's going to be enough shaking that you cannot use that centrifuge again until you recalibrate it, assuming it even survived.
Right, yeah.
And so you also had that. You had the facilities at Natanz, which were only partially buried. They used some Tomahawk missiles against that, and 2 of these bunker-busting bombs. And then the last facility, to me, is really interesting. That's the Isfahan. They used Tomahawks against that. It was China that helped Iran build Isfahan. And what is Isfahan? Isfahan was the facility where they would gasify the uranium. So that's the facility that you'd take the natural uranium, the yellow cake, and you'd put in the fluorine gas, and you'd create uranium hexafluoride, which is what you would then ship off to those centrifuges to get spun.
Yeah, right.
They also had other components for their nuclear weapons program at that facility, because obviously to make a bomb, you need more than just weapons-grade uranium. You need other components and parts. And that's why that facility was important.
It all came from the Chinese. A couple of things in response to that. One, I'll get back to the China. I was curious when you said that the Chinese are still building nuclear bombs. I mean, why are we still they're still growing their arsenal? Are they?
They are massively growing their arsenal. Yeah, by about 20% per year that we know of.
What's the point of that? I mean, we get it. Like I mean, like you said, with whether it's North Korea or Pakistan or India, it's like, okay, you have them, you've made your point. Okay, we're not.
Well,
why are they still?
So part of the issue is that they believe. There's 2 things. They believe, and you've heard their generals say this for the last 30 or 40 years. They'll say in public, as if it's like an unguarded moment, but it's really sending a message. They'll say, well, we don't believe the Americans would be willing to exchange Los Angeles for Taipei. They've said that in public,
sure.
I think more than once.
I think we should hear them out.
And so
You're saying, Chuck?
Hey, there's a reason you moved from California. You know?
That's right.
Come on.
Well, it wasn't for the nuclear range fan, okay? I know that one of the safest places in the world to be from a standpoint of incoming ICBMs is Texas, but that's not why I moved here. Okay, so please, thank you. So when it comes to the way China looks at this is they want to have enough of a threat of nuclear annihilation that they think they could scare America into not intervening to help our friends and allies in Asia. So, for example, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, or Taiwan, China has offensive designs on all of those nations. And so by threatening America with nuclear attack, they're suggesting that we won't have the guts to do anything about it, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why Trump's attack on Iran helps increase American credibility and deterrence. Yeah. Because deterrence isn't just the capacity to do something, it's also the will to use it and the impression of your potential enemy of the will to use it. And Trump just showed a lot of will to use American power, which I think increases the likelihood of peace in the near future.
And I want to ask you about that, Chuck, because I think if you looked at a lot of the conversation that was coming in the wake of Operation Midnight Hammer, which, by the way, is a sick operation name. I think we can all agree.
Yes.
But if you look at a lot of the talking about it, like the geopolitical meaning of the attack, is that they, depending on the different circles you listen to, that this is the establishment of the Trump doctrine. And albeit, I would argue, a very simple doctrine is just you cannot have a nuclear weapon. Or if you're a state that currently doesn't, you cannot go and get one. And we're willing to do what is necessary to prevent that. Do you see this foundationally and geopolitically speaking as the formation of a doctrinal stance, one that I thought we've, had in the past, but now we're actually seeing being enforced? Do you think this is a foundation of that? And how, I would say, what other garnishments would you put on there? What else would you embellish this doctrine with?
So I think it's the final repudiation of a doctrine that was enunciated kind of at its peak by former Secretary of State, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, when he said, if you break it, you have to fix it, right? If you break it, you own it. That was kind of the apex of what has been thrown about in these days by the detractors of it as neocon.
Nation building.
Right, where basically everybody yearns to be free. Everyone yearns to have self-governing democracy. And wouldn't it be better if the nations that we're concerned about are governed that way, because then they're less likely to want to go to war against us? The problem with that very egocentric philosophy is that most other nations are in fact incapable of self-governed democracy with rule of law, et cetera. The American experience came out of centuries of religious warfare, of civil war in England and conflict in Europe, and learning here on the North American continent. And it's hard. It's rare. You look around the world, it's actually a rare, difficult thing to do. And so this hubris that somehow we could make Afghanistan into like the 51st state, or make Iraq into this modern pluralistic democracy like Maryland or something, maybe even like New York City, is just a falsehood. And so what you see then is that Trump is going back to more Jacksonian roots, which is, I like to say, let's make punitive expeditions great again, right? So in other words, just because you do something to us and we want to defend ourselves and eliminate the threat does not incur a moral obligation on us to rebuild your country to our specs. In fact, we should just leave the rubble and the bodies as a warning to other people not to mess with America. It's a lot cheaper.
So this segues
Rubble
into...
doesn't make trouble.
This segues, by the way, Impiga is probably not going to end up on a hat somewhere. But I want to jump ahead. This is one of the questions I was going to have for you. So let's just jump into the politics of this a little bit. The right coalition has always been, you're either, have had sort of an advancist policy of, spreading democracy throughout the world, sort of the Bush neocon, or you're an isolationist, right? Which is, only do it here at home. It seems to be, maybe it is Jacksonian. Maybe it's not the first time that we've had a group on the right who has felt this way, but it seems like there definitely is among the MAGA contingent people who believe exactly that, which is use the American military force to protect American interests, but then get the hell out of there.
Right.
Which is if the nuclear program is a threat to America and you can justify that to the American people, and not that we just talked about, not that any of our men were in danger, but it's still they could have been. They could have.
They were in danger.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. So not but not like boots on the ground type danger. But we are taking that risk. And if the threat is worth the risk, then we do that. But we don't stay there. We you said, you create the rubble, then you get out there. It seems like that's either Trump's prevailing position on this, and so MAGA is kind of following him in a way that a way that I don't think has been seen before on the right, and that may end up becoming the GOP position on things going forward on foreign policy.
It's important to understand that for a long time, certainly in my living memory and for most of recent history, it's been shaped by the realities of the Cold War. So you had these two great blocs, and then China kind of was either an independent player or sometimes aligned with the Soviet Union. And everything was seen through the lens of proxy wars or battles on the margins, because it was always understood that if America came into direct conflict with the USSR, it probably would end in a nuclear holocaust. And so we somehow managed to avoid that. And then when the Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s, it was the end of history, right? And so now America was the world's sole superpower. And in that moment, very soon after, you had 9/11. Mm-hmm. And so you had essentially people who always believed in more of the universality of democracy and of human rights were not only in charge, but had no opposition big enough to push against. Mm-hmm. And so all of these theories were able to then be put into practice in Iraq, where it wasn't the abject failure that some people claim it is. Or the Iraqi government is independent. They hold elections. Yes, it's corrupt. Is it as pluralistic as we would like? No, it's not. But they're functioning. Afghanistan, of course, completely different story, right? Mm-hmm. Afghanistan is back to the Dark Ages, which is what they seem to want, right? And so,
but as long as they're not staging attacks on the United States,
right? And see, that's the key
who
thing.
cares?
That's the key thing, right?
Sucks
the Taliban
they
have no military-industrial complex, right? They don't have the ability to make, as it turns out, when you run a society that wants to be illiterate, it's hard to make missiles and nuclear weapons. So they're not a threat in the traditional sense. They could once again be a host to terror groups that want to attack, like Al Qaeda was back in the late 90s and early 2000s. But that's the extent of the threat from Afghanistan. And so the last thing to understand about this drive, and the reason why it isn't going to be dead forever, is that if you look at America's founding, and the founding principles of human rights and individual franchise, and the fact that our government exists to preserve our liberties, it leads to a desire to have a moral foreign policy and to have an idealistic reason for our adventures overseas. Now, John Quincy Adams, I think it was, warned against this when he said, America does not seek to go abroad and seek of monsters to destroy, right? And he gave that speech to Congress, I think, while Secretary of State. And he said, but we are going to be a friend and an ally of democracy everywhere, right? So what he's saying is, we'd love to see more democracies around the world, but let's not go around trying to seek to make that happen through force of arms. He made that warning, what was it, around 1825, somewhere that time? So we have struggled with this for a while because Americans at the end of the day are kind of, they're left a little unsatisfied if we only do our foreign policy like our European friends or like the Russians or the Chinese do, which is realpolitik. In other words, what's good for us, national security, period, full stop. We don't care about morality. We don't care about ethics. We don't care about what happens to other people. That's hard to sustain that in the American context. We always want to be the good guys. And that's where we struggle with this desire to intervene in other people's affairs because we want to help out. We're like missionaries with rifles.
Well, one of the arguments that the neocons would make is you know if you go in and you don't do regime change, then whatever it is that you toppled, could be worse,
Right.
And so for us to just go in and blow up a bunch of stuff and then walk out and say, hey, Iran, if you want to change your government, then you change it. We're not going to get involved. Well, what it could change into could be worse than what is there now. That's what they always try to use is kind of the fear mongering to say that's why that's why you go back to Colin Powell. If you break it, you own it. And we're saying, no, we're just going to break it, and they can do whatever they want with it after it's broken.
Right. I mean, you could argue that if you break things consistently enough, that whomever it is that takes over from the ashes and the rubble will get the message and maybe decide not to do that again, right? And again, it's a lot cheaper to do. And you also, though, have to look at the history of a place and its culture. So, again, one of the false lessons drawn that was drawn universally when it should have been drawn more, in a prescribed way, was when you look at the post-World War II occupations of Western Europe and Japan, and how what America did with the Marshall Plan and with building of NATO and all this stuff was that we needed to have a vigorous and prosperous Europe and Japan to be able to push back and contain the Soviet Union. Well, you're dealing with nations that already had very high literacy. They were already industrialized before World War II. They had rule of law after a fashion, and so it was pretty easy to encourage them to be more pluralistic democracies and allies of us. Okay. Seems to work for Japan or Western Europe. But then you look at Afghanistan and you're like, how does this feudal tribal society that has always had a decentralized confederacy form of government, how is that in any way like, let's say, Western Germany, right? It's like, excuse me. Yeah. And then to add insult to injury, when we were rebuilding Afghanistan shortly after we toppled the Taliban government back in, 2003 or 4, it was the French who wrote the constitution for the new Afghan government with a centralized form of government, completely contrary to Afghan culture and history. And so I think that the failure of that mission was kind of baked in from the start with very unrealistic objectives.
And Derek, although it's probably the most unpopular opinion right now, it hasn't stopped senators like Lindsey Graham from literally on the floor a couple of days ago calling for regime change. Do you think there's any appetite for that? I mean, this is, I go back to the Iraq War and kind of the justifications for that, but of course you had a president and an administration that was pushing for that, and you don't have that this time. But you never, these things can't start until somebody starts it. And so here's Lindsey Graham, and I'm sure he's talking to people and forming a coalition, Tom Cottons of the world. I don't know, but regime change, is it likely?
I think, and this is an important point that Chuck was making, is you need to separate regime change from regime change TM, right? Like the way that it gets bandied about. If you're talking about regime change by decapitation and see what comes next, I think that is that might be a viable model for Iran. I'm not advocating for it, but I'm saying it belongs in the discussion. But if you want boots on the ground, let's get people purple dye on their fingers and stuff like that, and think that in the next 5 years we're going to start having, the Karachi Met Gala. That model I think is completely off the table, right?
Yeah,
I think that is, I don't see that being sustainable for the reasons Chuck illustrates. Not every society is a small L, small D, liberal, democratic republic. They just haven't been bombed into it yet.
Yeah.
I think that that's off the table. But I do think that when it comes to if you need to neutralize specific targets that are malefactors of the United States, I think that is very much in the deck of cards.
I think it's important to
real quick, Chuck. Senator Cruz's nuanced position on this is, of course, we all support regime change. If you could wave a magic wand and change the regime, you'd want that. But we're not willing to do what it takes to do the Iraqi-style regime change, and so he's for it, but he's against it. And does that seem to be the sort of third way position on this?
Well, and I'd have to say that Israel even did that in their operation. So they killed a lot of key generals, but in so doing, what they were showing the Iranian regime was that if this goes further, we can topple your government. So don't push us, don't make it go further. Mm-hmm. And so they had killed enough to show the capacity to do so, but not so much as to necessarily fatally destabilize the regime. So I think even the Israelis were potentially concerned that if they push the malocracy too far, that maybe you end up with the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, in charge, right? So then it becomes not just a theocratic dictatorship, but a military theocracy dictatorship, which would potentially be even worse.
Can you explain something about the Iranian response? I mean, the more this all gets exposed, the more feckless the Iranians really look. I mean, of course, you had all those crazy covert ops where the beepers were exploding and the walkie-talkies, and so if I was an Iranian official, I'd be terrified that I don't know what's going on around me, and my water bottle could blow up. The next thing.
That's part of the plan.
But that response that they had, where in response to our doing the bunker busters, where they attacked our Air Force base in Qatar. But can you explain what that was? They called us to tell us that they were sending the rockets, and what in the hell was that?
Yeah, so essentially what they were doing was partially through Iranian pride and partially through internal messaging to their own people to show that they were in charge. They launched supposedly the same number of missiles and rockets at U.S. bases in the Gulf, not just at Qatar, but also in Bahrain and I think maybe even UAE. Mm-hmm. So supposedly the same number of missiles as the number of bombs and tomahawks we launched, right? But because it was a display, right, as you point out, it was for propaganda purposes, for internal propaganda purposes, like, look at us, we're still strong enough that we can shoot back at the terrible Americans, the great Satan. And so that was for internal propaganda consumption. And because they didn't want the war to escalate, and they didn't want Americans to die, and they didn't want a president who's shown his willingness to use American force to escalate even further, they gave us advance warning, and as a result, no Americans were injured or killed.
Yeah, we shoot them all down. But I mean, did the people but within 24 hours, everybody knew the story. Everybody knew that they had told us. Do the people? I mean, I get the internal stuff, but
they don't have deep cable in Tehran.
They don't have Twitter and Tehran.
Yeah, it's harder to get the real news, and plus the administration there puts a lot of effort into shaping the information battle space in Iran.
Yeah. So
one of the ways they keep in power is by manipulating the truth.
Did you see Trump's explanation of that actual thing at the NATO summit? He was like, they said, we're going to shoot some missiles at you. Does 1 p.m. work? And it was a master Trumpism, I think.
We got a longtime listener and caller gave us a question for you, Chuck. Does anything about how our operation was handled, or anything over the last week or so, does it expose any weak or soft points in our response? Is there anything that we could learn from this, other than how badass we are? Is there anything that we could learn from this in terms of our response, or interests overseas, or even foreign policy?
There's a couple of things that could continue to concern me, and you saw it in today's news conference with the president in NATO, where he was asked a question by a reporter who works for BBC Ukraine, and her husband's in the Ukrainian military, and she asked the president whether America would be open to selling Ukraine more Patriot missiles. And he kind of indicated that, yes, he's open to that, but we don't have very many, right? And that we've been using a lot of them not only in Israel and with these recent attacks in the Gulf, and that they work very well. They have they intercept every time, he said, ever the salesman, right? But we don't have a lot. And so the thing that really concerns me is that you have this ongoing rare earth minerals boycott by China, which they said they were lifting, but I haven't seen evidence yet. Though a lot of those elements that China has the world market cornered in are needed for not only the electronic components in our missiles, but also in some of the sensor systems, the windows, the optical windows that are used in some cases, depending on the system. And so we're not making enough of those very complex, costly, quickly consumed things like the missiles. And then our Navy is not big enough. And so what's happening now is our Navy is being so used around the world that we are pushing equipment and sailors to their limits. And what will end up happening there is you get deferred maintenance, you start getting accidents, people start to die, the equipment becomes less effective or it goes offline because you don't have the spare parts for it. And so we are really straining right now. We are living off of the old dried fruit, if you will, of the end of the Cold War era. Remember, I mentioned the B-2, right? My old boss in the Pentagon, who was a bit of a jokester, had a picture. I think it was, Derek, was it the B-47 that was the original flying wing? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the
36, I believe.
The B-36, whatever. So the original flying wing made in the late 1940s looks an awful lot like the B-2, except it was propeller driven. And she had this big portrait of this old post-World War II flying wing in her office. And when people would walk into her office, they'd look at it, and if they were read into the B-2 program, they would go white and think that she was violating highly classified information. And then she could test them to see if they would, in fact, admit or inappropriately, well, what are you doing with that B-2? What are you talking about? That's the the B-36. I have no idea what
you're actually correct. It was the YB-49.
YB-49.
Yeah.
Okay.
That old Pentagon humor.
Yeah, exactly.
Joking around classified material.
So here's the point, though, is that was like 1987, right? so the B-2 was already like in prototype in 1987, right? And so here we were going to build like 120 of them. We only built 21. One's crashed so far. We only have 20 of these things, right? And so it's important to understand that so much of our military legacy right now is from old investments made during the Cold War.
And Chuck, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I know we've talked about this internally, and I think that launching off Brian's question on what weaknesses does this reveal, I think one of the ones that we have to address is we'll say the sanctity of the intelligence community. Ugh. Because I mean, not but 48 hours after, probably before even the ink was dry on at least a preliminary draft of a battle damage assessment of a BDA, the New York Times and CNN had it in their hands. I mean, this is highly classified material, which would probably, I wouldn't say probably, it is necessary that it contains sources and methods, right? Or ones that at least sources of methods that can be derived. And it's in the hands of, the press for political purposes. Right. And that's the important thing to remember, for political purposes. And, my solution to this involves, a naval yardarm. What do we do about this particular, I would say, culture within a large sub-institution of defense intelligence apparatus, and how do we extirpate it?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a problem since before President Trump was president, right? So you see the intelligence community. By the way, I'm part of the intelligence community. I'm a retired Army intelligence officer, lieutenant colonel. I had a top secret clearance for a quarter century. And so I look at this stuff, and it's so dispiriting and shocking to me because intelligence is only effective if it has two components to it. Number one, it has to be accurate. Number two, it has to be believable. You have to have the trust that the person that you're briefing believes that you're giving them a good intelligence briefing. And if you don't have those two elements, if it isn't correct or very accurate, and if you don't have credibility, then the decision maker that you're briefing, what you're doing is completely worthless. And so if you go back and you look at Trump, ever since he went down the escalator, right, the elements of the intelligence community have been at war with the guy. You had the Russian collusion hoax. You had Schumer, right, the current minority leader in the Senate. What do you say? The intelligence community has, what was it, 5 ways from Sunday of getting at you? You better watch your back. It's a rough paraphrase.
Right.
But excuse me, Schumer was correct. And so then you have, like today, FBI Director Kash Patel is going back to Congress with additional evidence that the Chinese had smuggled in almost 20,000 forged driver's licenses, and the FBI had a confidential informant that these were part of an effort to engage in election fraud in the 2020 election. And then that report, I remember hearing about the driver's licenses back in 2020, just in isolation, right? Just, oh yeah, the Chinese are fake driver's licenses. They do, they counterfeit everything. So we now find out that the FBI suppressed the report so that when then Director Wray went before Congress and swore when he was under oath that there was no evidence of foreign powers trying to meddle in our elections, he lied to Congress because this report was known to him and was suppressed. That's part of the same problem that you're talking about here with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which I happen to have worked in for a time.
Yeah. Well, there's two problems, and this goes to the headline today is the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's response to all of this, which is one is that number one, it's bad enough that the report leaked at all, but number two, they're also saying that it's not accurate. That in fact, he called it low confidence, and he has this great quote where he says, "And why was it low confidence? Because all of the evidence of what was just bombed by 12 30,000-pound bombs is buried under a mountain. So if you want to make an assessment of what happened at Fordo, you better get a big shovel." And he makes a good point. He's like, how could they possibly have done an assessment over the last 48 hours that has any kind of confidence, just using satellite imagery that everyone else can look at? How could they really do any kind of accurate assessment when all this stuff is buried under a mountain?
Yeah, so part of the problem is with those first few satellite images is you're not going to get a lot of data with those images. But eventually, when you get more passes over the target, you can do what's called mensuration, where you take and essentially create like a 3D image. And with that, you can start to estimate how much Earth has been displaced, right? So if you're just looking overhead and you have a flat picture and you see maybe little poked entrance holes, you're like, okay, fine. It looks like it's just a flesh wound, right? Well, then
nice
you get additional passes, and what you can see is, oh, that's interesting. The roof, the stone roof over this underground facility, is now 40 feet lower than it was before the attack. Oh, gee, how did that happen?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, because it caved in the ceiling, right? And so that's the sort of additional information that you can get. Now, in addition to that, Israelis have operatives on the ground in Iran, right? So you're getting human intelligence from whatever sources, like your Iranian sources that say, oh yeah, it was out there and it's a mess, right? Or signal intelligence, where you have Iranians telling each other what they're seeing, right? So there are multiple ways, right? Any good intelligence product has more than one thing that gave you the answer, like in other words, signal intelligence plus satellite imagery, right? Those are two sources. You want more than one source to be able to have high confidence.
Yeah. We'll quickly jump into our 10-minute drill here, where we talk about, get into our final 3 segments here, but stick with this, Chuck. We'll just jump right into the polling one that we always do. Survey says the results are in on on Trump's decision to bomb Iran. 53% of voters approve of Trump's decision to bomb Iran, and only 39% disapprove, with 8% not sure. 53-39. Is that I mean, it's not really red hat, blue hat, right? Because
Right.
you usually get around like 55-45 if it's purely partisan, and there may be a lot of conservatives or GOPs in that 39% who are as we talked about the split in MAGA. Does that surprise you at all that to see those numbers, a majority of Americans?
Not at this early date, right? So give it 6 months where, let's say, there's continued peace, at least emanating from Iran, where there's continued or enhanced evidence that they've given up on their nuclear program, and you may see better numbers because, of course, success has many fathers and defeat is an orphan.
Right, yeah. And this one also has 51% approving of Trump's handling of the Iran-Israel crisis, while 40% disapprove. I'm just curious what the 40% are disapproving of. I mean, especially with his outbursts, yesterday, he's showing that he's not just favoriting our ally here, which is Israel. He's expecting them to follow the deal and yelling at them and saying, I'm actually more angry at Israel. I think that's what we want to see.
Yeah, I just think that we've gotten to a point in America now, especially with the president, where he's such a decisive figure, and he doesn't mince words, as we've seen recently, and the opposition to him has become so shrill that it's just difficult for a lot of people to give that up and just to objectively analyze what the guy's done, which I think is remarkable. And maybe you're beginning to see a split when you saw what happened in the House the other day with impeachment, where half the Democrats didn't vote for impeachment. That was remarkable.
Yeah. And Derek, you saw AOC had probably some of the most reported comments on this, saying that the mission and the action that he took in Iran was unconstitutional.
Yes, noted authorization of military force critic Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. No, I was having a discussion internally about this because I am one of the guys where I would like to see a more robust legislative support for for even just preparing the president with, extemporaneous war-making powers. I mean, but I think that's a general, widely held position in the United States. The problem is, and the reason it's really rich coming from like AOC, is because where was, Biden, for his many faults, did also use military force in the Middle East. Where was all the calling for congressional hearings on that? Where was that impeachment? Yeah. These people, and I use the term people loosely, basically have such a situationally oriented moral code that they really shouldn't be taken seriously. And I like the people of, the place that just elected a socialist want to send her to Congress. That's fine. That's their right as in a democratic republic. But that being said, we shouldn't be seeing her as a serious intellectual figure here when she happens to be right about one thing when applied at the only time that it cuts against her interests.
But it does, I think it does confuse, particularly a younger generation that didn't follow the Iraq War and all of that, as closely as we did. We're going to have this debate again about what it means to declare war and what it means and what a executive, what the president's authority is with regards to directing the military to do some kind of kinetic action. You don't need congressional approval to do anything, to do everything.
But my point being is that absent that debate, we have just a standing AUMF to justify that. And we should be having that debate on that. We can't just choose to have that debate the one time that it actually gets used, is my point.
The final stat, Chuck, on this, 49% of voters want the U.S. to support Israel. That feels a little low. But just 8% say they want us to support Iran in this. So who are the 8%?
I bet they have keffiyehs on and they're at the bridge overpass right now.
Just remember that that half of the people in the U.S. have below average intelligence by definition.
34% say we should support neither. Is that why that number's so low? And do you think that 49% is so low?
If you're because people, if you're on the left or if you're on the isolationist right, you don't want to support anybody, and especially when it comes to Israel, right? Israel is particularly controversial on both the modern far left and the far right. You see all kinds of weird coalitions coalescing around hatred towards Israel in particular, and frankly, it bleeds over into anti-Semitism quite regularly.
For our lies, damn lies, and statistics segment, this gets off of foreign policy just for a second, but I'd love to get you guys' opinion on this. Inflation, apparently, the inflation rate slipped 2% in April, lower than expected. Oil is down, eggs are down, food is down. We're seeing that the hysteria over the tariffs is not showing up in these numbers. That's what CNBC has reported. Here we are. We're a month past the tariffs, past Liberation Day, and all. We're expected to see higher food prices. And in fact, inflation is not going up, which is great. I mean, 2% isn't a whole lot. But Chuck, what do you make of the economic numbers?
Two things. In the first round of tariffs in Trump's first administration, there was no evident inflation caused by that. Now, they were targeted on China, and what China was doing was both manipulating its currency and eating the tariff. They weren't passing on the cost of the tariff because they wanted to maintain market share. They wanted to continue to destroy businesses in America. For them, it's strategic to try to shut down competitors in America, in other countries, so that they are the sole manufacturer of things. The other thing that's important to understand, in the modern economy, services actually outweigh goods. So the bigger part of the economy is services, not stuff, right? And so it's not shocking to me that you haven't seen anything yet, for two reasons. Number one, the importers of foreign products, especially of Chinese products, bought a huge amount, an extra, like double the amount of product in March and April prior to the tariffs kicking in. And so now they're kind of working through that inventory that they had purchased. That's number one. Number two, China's probably doing the same thing they did the last time and eating most of the tariff costs because they do not want to lose market share.
Derek, 2% of a $200 grocery bill is only $4, and so the question is always: are we going to feel it? Is the average American going to feel like the prices are getting lower, or that they're spending less money than they were?
Well, conceptualize this in the correct way, though. That's it. They only increased 2%, so it's one of the things where we still have I would say a level of desensitization, including to the ratcheting effect. From the Biden administration, just because it was, quarterly 8%, or whatever it was. And so I think that dropping to 2%, which is actually in line with historical averages, it's still, people are a little sensitive to it, a little gun shy about it, because there's the recent memory of the price shocks from, all of 10 months ago. And so I think that there's going to be, I think the Trump administration on this, it is a good sign, don't get me wrong, but I think that it's also one where I think it could be largely more politically damaging because, again, if I'm sitting here explaining this, this is not what, people feel when they open their wallet is Derek's 45-second nerd out, right? So,
Chuck, another statistic I'll throw at you. Texas, again, was the largest job creator year over year. Again, in March, 213,000 jobs created over that year. Texas is number one. I've been told by reliable sources that all this conservative legislation that we passed is going to destroy our economy, and people are going to stop moving here. And if we don't legalize abortion tomorrow, then again, is this all politically driven?
Yeah. So all things being equal, maybe those things that the big corporate America was scaremongering about might have in fact been factors, but all things are not even remotely equal. So I actually looked at the data fairly recently with my old home state, California. And so I was looking at private sector job growth in the two most populous states and then comparing it to the U.S. Job growth. And I went back to, when did I go back to? I think I went back to the beginning of COVID just to see how things have happened since then. In California, the rate of job growth there, if I remember correctly, is about 65% below the national average.
Wow.
So they're only making about 1/3 of the rate of job growth as the nation as a whole. And this is, by the way, taking out Texas and California. So I just had the other 48 states, right? Texas, if I remember correctly, was 126%. So we are more than double the job creation rate of the rest of the country. Yeah. And of course, if you compare us to California, what would we'd be like, 5-6 times greater than their rate of job growth?
Yeah.
Yeah, so all things are not actually equal.
All right, what to watch for? What's coming up, Derek? What's on your radar?
Well, we said it earlier. It's a special session. It's going to be what specifically we're watching for is what's going to be on the call, and if that's going to be something that James Quintero loses his summer vacation over. So.
Even though it's political, I love the politics stuff, and we're definitely getting into the silly season now. We're getting close to sessions done, and now it's all politics here for the next 18 months. So some of these, a lot of people are starting to announce, especially for the statewide positions for Attorney General and for these various statewide positions, but also some people are retiring. So some senators and some House members are retiring, and then people are starting to jump into those races as well. So I'm excited to see how it all kind of shakes out and the timing for everybody. And so we might actually have some. Well, I don't feel like during the last off-season election in 2022, there was a whole lot of shakeup. It was just pretty much everybody was going to get their old job back. But I think things are going to be different here, and we'll see what the lieutenant governor does. There's a lot of speculation on what he's going to do. So interested to watch that. What about you, Chuck? Next couple of weeks, next couple of months, what are you watching for?
Gosh, what am I watching for? I think with the president on a roll, I'd like to see what happens with reconciliation. I know that there's still a lot of tension between various Republican factions. You've got some Republicans in these high tax blue states like New York and California that very much want to see the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction go up. Currently, it's capped at $10,000. They'd like to see it at $30,000 or $40,000. And then on the other hand, you have some of the Freedom Caucus folks who not only don't want to see that, but they'd also like to see steeper cuts with these green subsidies that are causing an overinvestment in wind and solar. And of course, there's also big divisions between the House and the Senate because in the Senate, there's even less interest in the SALT issue because the SALT issue only affects a few large population but blue states like New York and California, right?
Illinois.
But in the House, the SALT concerns are a little overrepresented because, of course, it's population proportional representation, and these high-cost blue states tend to have a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so there's like basically four different factions: House, Senate, Freedom Caucus, Republicans from these blue states.
We also talked about with Brad Johnson last time about the division in the House and the Senate on AI regulation and how that they're trying to preempt all state laws on AI regulation, which is crazy. Texas, of course, has been leading on AI regulation, or however you want to describe it. And so that would, all the good work that Representative Cabricleone did this session would be all for naught if they pass that through the BBB. So, all right, well, we will watch all of those issues, and we thank you for watching. We thank you for listening. This has been really informative and fun. Chuck, you're welcome back anytime. Now that you know that we have 6 million viewers,
that's right,
or watchers.
I think more people watch you than when I'm on Fox and Friends first.
that's never well, and then we clip it for you, and then so we get more viewers.
Notice the subtle flex on the part.
Yeah, I noticed that. So thanks for being here. We'll invite you back soon. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as we always like to say at the end of the show, in the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.